Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku is able to manipulate an endless supply of quirk energy within their body, movie. So before we start, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. So let's begin the story. It hurts. A young child, a boy with brown hair and teared up eyes, howled into the silence of the street, his leg bloodied up. Nearby, a man with messy black hair, freckles and kind green eyes looked over, frowning at the sight before hurrying over. He sat down near the kid and inspected the damage, wincing. The child had clearly tripped while running along, scraping his knee violently along the pavement and cutting it open. It hurts. It hurts. Oh dear, the man muttered quietly, kindly. He looked around and made sure no one else was around before bending down. It's okay, little man, it's okay. It will be fine, I'm going to help. The child still sniffled and cried, but the presence of another seemed to help slightly. The man smiled and gently took the young boy's hand. Here, hold your hand out please. He instructed and, with a shaky hand, the child did, as he was told, confused. The older man took a deep breath and started to focus. Something inside him began to form and began to mold itself. Like clay, it wrapped around itself and then, without warning, a light appeared in the man's hand. He put it in the grasp of the child and the light jumped up the kid's arm, going over him and to his head, his eyes lighting up before the light came down to his core, before finally fading. But the kid sniffed, only for the older man to gently shush him. Just put your hand over your leg, kid, and focus on wanting it to heal, okay? He instructed. Confused, the young child did so and, to his amazement, a golden light overtook the injury and caused it to begin to heal. Then, a moment later, the injury was gone, and so was the pain. The older man smiled. Neat, right? You have a quirk now, but be careful. Don't abuse it and don't go showing it off to people you don't know if you can trust. Can never be too careful in this day and age. Now, get going. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. The kid jumped up, looking a million times better already before turning and rushing off as his helper watched him with a smile. This man's name? Hisashi Shigaraki. Hisashi turned and began to continue on his way, but his smile fell slightly as his thoughts turned to what could have happened if someone else had been around. For it was 2036 and quirks had still yet to be majorly accepted. There were riots in the streets, protests, and witch hunts abound. Hisashi was sadly used to hate crimes from those who knew he possessed unique abilities, and he knew that if someone had seen him, they'd be likely to accuse him of attempting to kill the kid instead of helping them without any basis in that claim. He supposed that was the sad state humanity found itself in all the time, always blaming those who were different for things they never did, doomed to never learn their lesson while blinded by their hate. Truly, it was a shame. With a shake of his head, he lifted his head as he neared a house and put on a smile. It wouldn't dwell on such negative thoughts, that's not what his brothers would need. He pushed the door open and walked into a bustling kitchen with a 6-year-old boy with white hair jumping up and down excitedly, watching a middle-aged woman at the fridge. Nearby, in a crib, sat a young boy babbling away incoherently. I'm back, guys. Hisashi announced with a smile, getting all eyes to turn to him and being met with many smiles. Welcome back, Hisashi. Just in time, I need to feed Tamura, could you take over cooking for your little brother? The middle-aged woman asked and Hisashi nodded, smiling. Of course, mom. Always happy to slave away for my little bro. The freckled man chuckled, making his mother roll her eyes good-naturedly. Then get to it. She chuckled and so Hisashi did. He truly didn't mind, he loved his little brothers and was willing to do anything for them. A little cooking was the least he was able to do, rustling a pan back and forth filled with sizzling bacon. His father had passed away last year, so it fell to him to look after his younger brothers and protect him from the sad state of the world. Sadly, it seemed their father had possessed a powerful gene that had caused Hisashi and his younger brother to end up becoming what were known as quirked individuals. People born with extraordinary abilities, superpowers. Most people weren't keen on there being people stronger than them out there nowadays though, leading to the sad state of affairs where Hisashi and his mother had been trying to hide Hisashi's younger brothers for their own safety, keeping them away from the horrors of the world. The people who would be willing to kill 2 children without second thought simply because they were different. It wasn't any better on the quirk side either in plenty of places. The last 3 months had been a horrifying revelation for so many people that a war was brewing between those with quirks and those without, as a terrorist group had been wreaking more and more havoc. Hisashi still had a scar over his left eye as a souvenir of one of the group's attacks. He'd been unfortunate enough to have been near it when it happened. They used their quirks to destroy everything in sight, leaving chaos in their wake and chanting a single message. Our is might, might is right. Hisashi personally thought they were a bunch of nutters who needed their heads knocked against a solid steel bar to fix whatever went wrong in their brains. Oh shoot. His mother's voice came from upstairs, surprising him and pulling him out of his thoughts. Hisashi. I forgot to get baby food while I was at the grocery store. Could you really quickly go over and get some, please? On it, Mom. Hisashi called out as he put the bacon onto a plate. Bacon's ready. Thank you. He heard his mother call back, leaving him to turn, rustling his younger brother's hair before he rushed off into the street. He set off at a brisk pace to the nearest grocery store he could find and was just about to walk in when, crunch. Something hard hit the back of his head and pain blossomed out all around him, his vision going dark. The last thing he felt before consciousness left him was his body hitting the gravel on the floor. 6 months later, Hisashi was not in a good way. Broken fingers, a black eye, busted and bleeding lips. His foot was practically useless with how squashed it was now. There were scars and holes all over him from the many places he'd been cut. Bruises from the many places he'd been beaten. From the second Hisashi had woken up 6 months ago after being attacked, he'd been under constant, mind-breaking, intense torture. It had only taken him a week to figure out why. What's your answer? A woman spat in his face, snarling at him with a look practically begging him to refuse again. Will you do it? Thoughts of his brothers went through his head. Fuck you. He spat out weakly, only to get smacked in the face. He just spat out the blood. Never going to do it. He tried to ignore the sound of a blowtorch turning on behind him. He couldn't ignore it when his skin began to curl up and his nerves were set alight with pain. He screamed all the way until he passed out, not for the first time and not for the last. It was almost a whole year later when he finally caved. They were bringing in the rack of knives when all the pain he'd been through flashed through him and he finally broke. His voice was hoarse and quiet. I'll do it. He wanted to be sick at the grins he saw on their faces. He knew he would hate himself for whatever came next. What they had been demanding of him for the whole year was not something any good could come from. He'd heard it just a week into the torture. We know you can make quirks, Shigaraki. We've been keeping an eye on you for quite some time now. Now, you're going to help us win and show those quirkless bastards we rule this world. What do you even want? What do I want? Well, I thought that would be obvious. I want you to make a quirk. A time quirk. You're going to help us go back in time to before they started developing ways to fight our quirks and we're going to kill everyone who opposes us so quirks can dominate the world. What? No. That's it. I'll never. The knife to the leg had kept him from saying any more at the time. Now, he was too broken to refuse. He just wanted the pain to stop. He couldn't stand any more of this. His straps were removed and he was thrown to the floor, dragged up by his hair, as the woman who had been holding him captive for so long, a red head with red evil eyes and a malicious smile, watched with glee. Well, hurry up. With a gulp, he put his hands together and began focusing on crafting. He had no idea what he was doing, however. He'd never made a quirk like this before. He didn't know what components went into it, what kind of energy was involved. He didn't know what he was doing, but he didn't want to be hurt anymore. He focused on time, he focused on his want to be away, he focused on everything he could to try and escape or give them what they want, to just end the pain. A minute later, his hands began to glow and he focused it all on himself. Focused hard on allowing himself to move away through time and without warning, there was a sudden explosion of light as several people were thrown around. When the light faded, Hisashi was gone. Well over a century later, his kind but broken green eyes opened up to find himself in the middle of a street where everyone was staring at him shocked before he passed out in pain. His only thought before he embraced the familiar world of darkness that was unconsciousness was that there were a lot more mutant types walking around than he remembered. Several days later, he'd awakened only for what he thought would be the worst shock of his life. Discovering he was trapped in the future with no way to go back. He was so sure there would be nothing worse he could discover than that. He'd thrown up as soon as he'd found out and cried for hours, mourning his lost family. It was the worst thing he could find out, surely. He was wrong. Did you hear? That impossible bank robbery, there's a bunch of rumors going about that it was all for one. A woman exclaimed excitedly in a cafe 3 months after Hisashi had begun getting used to his new life. Hisashi had stopped dead, spoon falling out his hand into his bowl of soup. Akiko, that's ridiculous. Everyone knows all for one is just a myth. No one can live that long. Another woman scoffed. Hisashi's blood felt as though it was slowly turning to ice. And someone who can steal quirks. Just doesn't happen. Well, why not? I mean, we've seen what other quirks can do, and we know for a fact some villain called All for One existed at some point. Akiko argued spiritedly as Hisashi's stomach started doing flips. It's a bunch of hooey, I'm telling ya. The other woman scoffed as they stood up and left, arguing all the while. Hisashi didn't move, however. He was scared out of his mind because this was not the first time he had heard of All for One. He knew an All for One not too long ago, yet a century ago at the same time. His younger brother called his quirk that and he could indeed take quirks. Was this coincidence? He hoped beyond hope that it was, but he shakily pushed himself as his thoughts went into overdrive. The facts would fit for it to be his younger brother. But why would he have become a villain? "Sir? Are you ready to go?" a waiter asked, eyeing him curiously. Hisashi nodded shakily, turning slowly as his mouth dried up. "And who should I make it out to?" Hisashi. He stopped himself, a sudden moment of clarity in between the panic. He refused to believe it, he couldn't, it made him sick to the core. But on the slightest chance his brother was still alive and was truly a villain, as those women had claimed. Midoriya. Hisashi Midoriya. Until he knew the truth, perhaps this was for the best. Several months later, Hisashi would be found in the library of Musatafu, scouring page after page of every archive on quirks, heroes, and villains there were to find, eager to find anything that would help him discover if the rumors about his brother were true. If they even were about his brother. Yet no matter how hard he looked, it was near impossible to find anything on All for One. His own family had been purged from existence, it would seem, a fact that tore Hisashi's heart asunder. No one remembered the Shigarakas. "Excuse me?" A kind voice spoke up and Hisashi turned, coming face to face with a beautiful green-haired woman who had kind eyes much like his own and a soft caring smile. She had a tag on her cardigan pronouncing her to be the librarian with the name Inko. "Would you like some help? I've noticed you come in here a lot and never seem to be able to find what you're looking for. That would be really appreciated, thank you." He nodded, not knowing, as he gave her a thankful smile, that they would be doing more than just helping each other for years to come. Almost 10 years after he met Inko, Hisashi had found himself in the hospital once more. This time it was not for an injury he sustained, however. No, instead, just 5 years earlier he and Inko had gotten married, in love with one another completely by then, their weekly meetups for research having turned into meetups for fun, until eventually they were well beyond the realm of friends. And now, Hisashi smiled as he felt his chest tighten, tears coming to his eyes as he stared down into a new pair of kind green eyes. Kind green eyes filled with the innocence only a newborn could have. "Hello, Izuku," he said, almost choking, as he smiled and gently caressed the baby's head. "It's me, I'm your dad." "Hello." The baby cooed at him curiously and he felt his heart swell with happiness, but he had to look up. Inko was looking at him with a broken smile. They were beyond happy, but both their smiles slowly faded as the tears came on, not happy, but sad. Scared. Broken. Hisashi's heart, previously swollen with happiness, now shattered into 1,000 pieces as the painful and depressing truth set in. To this day, they'd never found concrete proof that All for One was around, but Hisashi knew in his heart of hearts, with all the limited evidence he could uncover, somewhere out there, his brother was still alive, a villain, wreaking havoc. So long as he stayed, he put his son in danger as he continued to investigate, trying to find and now stop his brother. Without words, he embraced Inko, with Izuku gently cradled between them for their first family hug and, though it destroyed him to admit, almost certainly their last. "Please tell me you'll call," Inko sobbed, chest shuddering as she sniffed. "And right," he assured, burying his head into her neck. "I'll always be with you in my heart, I promise Inky, I promise." Just a month later, he'd find himself silently crying as he boarded a plane to America to keep his family safe as he followed a new lead in his investigation. He just hoped, as he flew away making the hardest decision he ever had, much harder than any he'd made during his time being tortured. He just hoped it would truly keep him safe and that his son, though he might not have truly gotten to know his father, would be happy. He wasn't to know, as he flew away, that he'd left behind perhaps the most powerful child in Japan. "Stop it, Kaken. You're hurting him." A 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya cried, standing on shaky legs in a fighting stance, standing guard over another child who lay crying on the ground, clutching a limp arm. His eyes were filled with tears as he shook violently, but he stood his ground. "If you don't stop, I'll stop you myself." Across from him, 3 boys the same age as he started, dumbstruck before snorting. The child across from him, a blonde-haired kid the same age as Izuku by the name of Katsuki Bakugo, suddenly chuckled cruelly as he hit his fist into his hand, an explosion going off from his palm. "You want to pretend to be a hero? You don't stand a chance without a quirk, Deku." Izuku's shaking became even more violent as the 3 boys suddenly rushed at him, explosions ripping from Bakugo's hands, his cronies just behind with rapidly extending fingers and wings spread wide. Izuku didn't know what to do, he wasn't a good fighter, he had no quirk he knew of to help, he'd never developed anything more than an aggravating sensation of watching colors manifest in his vision around him near people. He couldn't fight 3 quirky people. But the crying of the kid behind him emboldened him, reminding him someone needed help. He stood his ground and that's when it happened. The sensation. As the quirks were being used, it was like he could sense them coming from the boys before him. He could practically see the red angry color of Bakugo's quirk and he felt something pull inside him. The same sensation, the same red. He didn't know what he was doing, he just acted. He focused on letting that sensation flow through him, his hands lit up, he focused on that sensation going to himself. He focused, and a voice invaded inside his head. Quirk. Explosion can secrete an explosive substance which can be ignited via sparks in the hand. May cause powerful recoil, arm pain, and cramps. Izuku had no idea what to think, but Bakugo was atop him, and on instinct he raised up his own hands, and boom. An explosion was let off from Izuku's own palm. Izuku barely had a chance to see Bakugo's eyes go wide before he was thrown back violently. Izuku turned to see the other two kids coming at him, having slowed down in shock, and knowing he had to react, he threw both hands out. Boom. Boom. Both children were blown away, skidding across the ground as Izuku stared at his own hands in shock. How had he done that? Deku? Bakugo's angry roar made Izuku look up, heart clenched, as he saw an enraged Kitsuki storming at him. You thief. You stupid creep. Izuku gulped and rushed forward, putting both hands on Bakugo's stomach just in time to let out another explosion, faster than Bakugo by just a little bit due to being lighter, and blowing the blonde away. Izuku didn't think much more of it, turning and rushing to the other child's side. Come on. Let's go before they get up. Even hours later, as Izuku stopped being able to produce the explosions, Izuku would be staring at his own hands in shock and confusion, wondering what on earth happened. When he told his mother, she had gone wide-eyed and immediately rushed to the phone. All Izuku could figure out was that she had called the doctor and looked worried. A week later, he'd find himself in a doctor's office, looking at several charts and diagrams he didn't understand, x-rays, and more, everything filtering in one of his ears and out the other until finally, something stuck. He does indeed appear to have a quirk, if this story is true. Do you have any idea what it might be, Mrs. Midoriya? I do actually. Izuku's mother nodded, sighing, as she met the doctor's eye. It sounds like a stronger version of his father's. He had the ability to make and give quirks to other people. He could give 3 quirks to any one person and temporarily to himself before they'd fade away. We always just said he had a fire breath quirk for his safety. And what was this quirk called? The doctor pondered. Inko Midoriya looked up with a steelier gaze than most ever saw from her. All for all. You don't think you could give me a quirk to go back in time and retake my English exam, do you? It had been 8 years, almost to the day, well, a week to go, since Izuku had first developed his quirk. The unexpected and powerful quirk of All for All that he hadn't understood at all back then. It was more than just a powerful quirk. In a way, it was the quirk, it was something any person would clamber over to have if they had the choice. After all, why choose one power when, in theory, you could choose them all, as needed? Of course, not just anyone got this quirk. Izuku did, which meant that others didn't. Which naturally leads to jealousy, disbelief, attempts to downplay just how powerful or potentially heroic it was, and more. Personally, Izuku thought the societal issues with his quirk, and wow, would it never not be weird to think his quirk would be able to cover a scope that grand, started with Kitsuki Bakugo, the same blonde who tried to blow him to smithereens, as a kid being the popular boy. That let him start rumors even when Izuku had a quirk of his own. Perhaps, that is getting ahead of things though, because the issues started much earlier than that, really. Almost as soon as Izuku found out the name of his quirk. It wasn't much later the rules began. I'm sorry, I don't have time quirks. Ever. And, what was this quirk called? The doctor pondered. Inko Midoriya looked up with a steelier gaze than most ever saw from her. All for all. Izuku blinked, looking up at his mother with confusion and a furrowed brow as he tilted his head in confusion. What? But mom, dad's quirk is fire breath. Inko sighed a bit more softly as she turned to him, her hand lifting and gliding into his hair with ease, gently caressing his head, a feeling he couldn't help but lean into. That was one of his quirks, yes sweetie. But the woman turned back to the wide-eyed, curious doctor who quickly pulled out a notebook and began taking notes with curiosity and intrigue, an excited glint in his eyes at the notion of what he'd heard. All for All is a special quirk, part of a set of 3, but the other 2 don't much matter at the moment. As for what it is, it's a quirk that allows the user to create quirks. Temporary abilities. Fascinating. The doctor nodded, only to pause when Inko shook her head. No. Not temporary. Permanent quirks. She said simply, making the doctor's eyes go wide before she blushed slightly and hummed as she scratched the back of her head. Well, temporary as well, yes, but the purpose of the quirk is to give permanent quirks. You are being serious? The doctor asked in disbelief as he looked between the now once again serious look of the mother and the confused yet awe-filled expression of her child. You understand, of course, the body is not meant to handle a strain such as that. Copy quirks are often safe only because they are temporary. Multiple quirks without a body designed to handle it would rapidly degrade and destroy the body of anyone else due to the overwhelming pressure of the multiple quirk factors. Yes, I am aware. Inko nodded as she lifted a thumb up to her mouth, chewing on it for a moment, crossing her other arm over her body as she found herself contemplating her answer before pulling her thumb down again to meet the doctor's eye. I can't say I understand it perfectly or can explain it as well as my husband would be able to, but from what I understand, the issue with quirk factors is that they try to either blend or fight each other for dominance when forced together. A very crude explanation, but for simplicity's sake it is an apt enough analogy, yes. The doctor nodded with a curious raise of the brow. Does the process of this all for all work differently somehow? Perhaps keeping them separated fully? More or less, yes. Inko nodded with a small hum of her own. I am not sure how it works in Izuku or my husband's bodies, as they seem to be able to hold far more quirks than anyone else, that is assuming Izuku's quirk works exactly like his father's. For others though, Hisashi could only ever give 3 quirks, atop their original quirk. All it would take is a single usage, even accidental or minor, per day for about a week, and the quirk would settle in permanently. As for how it avoids the issue of wrecking the body, instead of being beside the original quirk factor, trying to merge or dominate it, all for all's quirks are placed above the original quirk-like layers, keeping them separated, but equally as prominent and powerful. The doctor nodded eagerly, his writing picking up in his notebook while Inko hummed, her eyes falling on the desk for a moment. Izuku tilted his head in confusion when he saw her subtly using her original attraction quirk. He didn't see what flew out that she hid in her pocket when the doctor wasn't looking, but he didn't say anything either. Honestly, his head was spinning as he tried to register this all. He could make quirks that was so cool. He had thought of so many powers that would be cool to have or that he'd love to experiment with, and now he could try them all. Yes, that could explain it. Why, that would mean these quirks are all essentially as powerful and able to be trained as any other freshly acquired quirk in a 4-year-old. This is quite the revolutionary quirk your husband and son have developed. I'm surprised it has not been heard of before. Well, Hisashi didn't like publicity. Inko said, and Izuku froze in his seat. He knew that was a lie. His dad joked a lot the few times they'd gotten to talk, and it was really rare to get the opportunity more than once a year that he'd love to take to a stage as a magician due to his youngest brother having had a phase of loving magicians the last time he saw him. It only took a couple more seconds of thinking to realize why his father and mother never told anyone. It was part of their hiding, and the danger his father had mentioned was the reason he had to stay away in the past. It left him biting his lip with concern as a thought struck him, a thought that made his insides burn. Is mom going to ask me to hide my quirk? Yes, I suppose it would be quite the crowd you would end up attracting. The doctor chuckled as he put the notebook down with an excited smile and a more manic glint in his eyes. Well, we should run tests right away to be safe. If your son could wait outside just a moment so I can talk to you about some private details, then you can run the gauntlet as it were with the other doctors to test his quirk. Izuku blinked while Inko nodded with a sweet smile. If Izuku had been looking closer, he would have noticed the strain in that smile and the flash of anger in his mother's eyes. Of course. Izuku, please go wait outside, sweetie. Oh, right. Okay, mom. He nodded and got up off the seat with a bounce in his seat in excitement, hurrying to the door and opening it before closing it and going to wait by one of the chairs. 5 minutes later, his mother would exit with a tight smile on her own as she walked up to him. Come on Izuku, let's go test your quirk. Right. Where's the doctor? Inko was quiet for a moment as they walked. He had some unexpected medical emergencies come up he'll need to deal with before he can keep helping people with quirks. Oh. Well, I can't wait to try my quirk. I had no idea it was so cool. 5 minutes earlier, almost as soon as the door closed behind Inko, the doctor stood up and walked over to his desk, pretending to be grabbing a file from the drawer while his other hand fell under the desk. Inko sighed as she stood up suddenly with a stiffer posture, a small frown on her face and dark look in her eyes as she held her hand out to the side. Holding a handgun. Looking for this, Dr. Tsubasa? The doctor turned and froze as he saw the gun in her hand and the glare in her eyes. A nervous chuckle escaped him as he slowly held up his hand and backed up. Ah, you found my self-defense method against aggressive. Just stop. Inko cut him off, making him stiffen further as her eyes looked straight at him and he shivered a little, feeling her anger rolling off her in waves. All for one isn't getting Izuku. That's final. But his eyes went wide as his jaw dropped at her knowledge before he froze, considering the name of her son and husband's quirk. Ah. Your husband. He's someone who was smart enough to teach me how to be wary of where All for One might be lurking. Inko responded calmly as she slowly began approaching, still keeping the gun to the side. Taught me how to spot the signs of danger. How to keep an eye on where he might have plants. Like a certain winged boy my son knows who just so happens to have no winged parents. You're aware of my grandson. Well, he would have been quirkless himself, but you're trying to distract me now. Inko cut him off, making him jump again as she suddenly pulled the gun up and cocked it, making him flinch. Wait. And then suddenly she dropped the clip, pouring the bullets on the floor and kicking them under the bed before pocketing the gun, which she highly suspected to still have one bullet loaded in it she didn't want him to get his hands on. I'm not you, Tsubasa. I don't have any interest in killing you, but I can't let you tell all for one about Izuku either. Well, I'm sure you know my silence can be bought. I have no interest in buying your silence either. Inko said blankly before, with speed the doctor never would have expected the mother to possess. Her hand was gripping his face tight as she glared quietly. Well, this is a predicament, but come now, you're not a combative quirk user. Attraction of small objects is not going to. If you really think my husband who can create quirks wouldn't think to give me one to deal with the day Izuku's quirk came in, you clearly aren't all that smart, doctor. Inko cut off, not even bothering to correct the assumption about the strength of her original quirk. Retrograde any memories anyone has made in their life, I can erase, permanently. The limitation is that I can't erase more than one person's memory a day, but unfortunately for you, I haven't used this quirk in a while. I should still know enough to reduce your mind back to when you were first born though. The doctor's eyes widened as he tried to pull his head out, only to find the woman's grip to be much stronger than she expected. Come now. There's no need to be hasty. I'd ask you to pass on my apologies to the other doctors for reducing your memories to the point you can't even feed yourself and then making them deal with you, but well, you won't remember this either of course. Wait. Please, mercy. Sorry Dr. Tsubasa, it's a shame they didn't catch the signs of brain damage sooner. And Inko's hand lit up with a dark blue glow. A moment later, Tsubasa fell to the ground with a thud, unresponsive and drooling over the tiled floor, the heaving of his chest the only sign of life. With a small hum she turned and walked to the door. Just be glad you didn't get any further with Izuku, or I might not have gone so easy on you. Fortunately, they weren't destined to have any more misadventures or unfortunate run-ins at the hospital, not that Izuku would be aware of even the first one. They simply found themselves testing the basics of his quirk with Inko being much more vague with the doctors from there and pretending to be just as shocked as anyone else when there were reports of an incident later. Izuku however continued on, blissfully unaware of it all and explaining his quirk as best he himself understood it, barely at all, to the nurse giving him tests. They weren't able to find out a lot about his quirk due to the nature of it making it somewhat dangerous to test, but they did manage to find out at least 3 details. 3 details that would help define how Izuku would use his quirk in future. 1. He couldn't give himself permanent quirks as easily as he could give them to others. While in theory he would be able to with time, just like his father, his quirk was more adverse to letting him keep the quirks he made as they were meant for others, not his own body. Despite this, just like his father he had a similar body that seemed to be more suited to housing multiple quirks that might allow him to use far more than anyone else he gave a quirk to. Speaking of, 2, the limit to how many quirks he could give another person was, theoretically, double that of his father's. It was stronger than his father's and would allow him to do far more with his quirk without worrying as much about overloading the people around him. However, this was all in theory solely from descriptions and tested compared with Inko's knowledge of Hisashi's own version of All for All. Finally, 3, the biggest advantage Izuku had over his father it seemed was not to do with the strength of the quirks or how many he could make, but how he could make them. As it would turn out, his mother's quirk hadn't been fully left to the side in favor of All for All, but rather his mother's quirk had mixed with his father's to give it an additional unique and useful addition. The sort of quirk sense, for lack of a better term. Yes, the weird colors Izuku saw around people were in fact quirks which raised so many questions. Why did some people have multiple colors? Were they dual quirks? Why did his own mother have 2 auras, one a lime green and the other a deep blue? How on earth did it work, since it couldn't be due to proximity? Because Izuku had seen colors around people all his life, even on TVs and recordings, like All Might. Oh god, All Might. What on earth was that luminescent rainbow aura he always had then? That couldn't be a normal quirk. Sadly, to all these questions, he only got the answer to one entirely different question. That being what he could do with such a quirk sight. This could be useful, if you can see quirks, then you'll be able to know what represents them, and more easily build them. The nurse had theorized, and Inko had nodded along eagerly with a spark in her eyes of relief. Oh, yes. That makes sense, it would be a great improvement on my husband's own, as well. He was always working blind so it was always risky, knowing Izuku can actually see what he's doing, as it were, is a huge relief. Soon after, they were leaving the hospital, and Izuku was riding on cloud 9 in excitement. They hadn't even reached the front door by the time it died down though, because he couldn't help but notice it. The way his mother was gripping the seat of the taxi they took back home too hard, how she kept chewing her lip, and how she kept shooting concerned glances his way. For a reason he was fairly certain he knew why, as well. So when they walked into their apartment and Inko asked Izuku to sit down on the couch so they could talk about his quirk, he was already bracing himself. In another time, Izuku would have expected, with how long his quirk took to come in, that he might have ended up sitting here without one at all with one question to ask. Can I be a hero? But that wasn't what was happening here. No, Izuku had no question at all. He only had something to say, as his mother sat down on the floor across from him at their table, kneeling and meeting his eyes. The soft worry was etched almost permanently into it, it seemed, as silence stretched between them, his mother opening her mouth a few times to talk, but faltering more than once. Izuku. Inko finally began with a soft exhale, as she met his eyes. This is going to be hard to hear, but I think we should hide your quirk. No. Inko paused, her eyes widening slightly in surprise, as her jaw dropped slightly, catching her son's gaze. His determined, slightly upset gaze didn't waver. To say she was shocked was an understatement, Izuku almost never talked back to her, and while he had tantrums, as a proper toddler like pretty much any of them did, she couldn't recall a time before now he went against what she said. Definitely, never with the conviction in his voice he held now. Izuku. The shorter of the green-haired mother and son duo took a somewhat shaky breath as he balled his fist together and asked a simple question. A question she should have seen coming. Is Dad's quirk why he isn't here? The sharp breath was more than enough of an answer, as Inko winced. Then slowly, she nodded. It's one of the reasons, yes, baby. Some people would do really bad things for a quirk like yours or your father's. There is more than that though. Your father has a brother who is a very, very bad person. If he found out about you for our safety, that's why your father moved to America. Land of freedom and all that. Izuku let out a shuddering breath as he thought about that, gripping his trousers with a frown. The last comment was probably a joke meant to cheer him up, but it wasn't nearly as effective as his mother might have hoped. Having to run from us doesn't sound very free. No, I suppose it doesn't. Izuku looked up, a final decisive look she didn't expect on her child at such a young age. I don't want to hide my quirk. I don't want to let Dad's brother take my freedom too. And well, there was no argument Inko could make that she wouldn't feel awful for, no matter how scared she was. Then, at least do this for me, Izuku. For about a year after that day, Izuku pretended to be ignorant of knowing exactly what his quirk was. He wasn't made to hide it entirely by his mother, but she had made him agree to act, as if the doctors were not fully aware of what it was yet. If it was a copy quirk or something more, so that Inko could prepare for the inevitable issues of his quirk becoming public. Izuku made a promise of his own, that no matter what it brought, he wouldn't let himself get hurt, so that his mother wouldn't have to worry. That was why he intended to figure out what it took to make quirk settle in permanently, by using Bakugo's quirk every night, at least twice, to make sure it was still there when he felt it begin to wane. And until they were ready, everyone would simply believe Izuku had a long-term copy quirk that latched onto explosion. He promised wouldn't tell anyone otherwise until they were ready. He'd break that promise about 3 months later. In the same incident that would mark the start of the rules, Izuku began personally setting out to use his quirk. Rule number 1. Never give quirks to others without explicit permission unless left with no other choice. Rule number 2. Always make permanent quirks unique for the people you give them to. It was, in hindsight, not an amazing idea though certainly an understandable one. Bakugo had, admittedly a bit more understandably than most of his other reasons to be angry with Izuku, not taken kindly to Izuku having his quirk and being just as proficient with it as he was. And Izuku really was proficient with it after watching all the moves the boy had managed. Izuku had thrown himself headfirst into trying to replicate many of them until he succeeded. Knowing it was possible was a great motivation not to give up with many of Bakugo's tricks until he got the blood's ability down. Unfortunately for Izuku, his class didn't take to this development as kindly as he would hope, though honestly, with how they always choose Bakugo first, he kind of expected this, declaring him to be a quirk thief rather than having any heroic ability. Which, even as a kid Izuku knew was just dumb. All he did was manage to copy Bakugo's quirk, it wasn't like he took Bakugo's version away, and on top of that he should surely have all the same merits as Bakugo regarding the quirk, but apparently when Izuku had it, it was villainous. At least Bakugo wasn't too fond of that insult either, although Izuku knew it was pretty much entirely because he was being indirectly insulted with it as well. It had all left a sort of gnawing guilt in Izuku's stomach, even if he didn't regret anything. Maybe that guilt was why, when he noticed Bakugo hissing quietly at the gate one day after practicing his quirk when no one was looking by blowing up his soda can, Izuku had latched onto the idea that had formed in his head with a soft gasp so quickly. He didn't think to ask, as he started focusing his real quirk, all for all, into his hands, recalling the color and feelings of a quirk he'd seen a nurse use at the hospital. He was still working on combining auras to make new quirks, but fortunately this quirk he happened to know from seeing a local athlete with it, so he could simply copy it. A soft red glow appeared in his hand, and he hid it behind his back as he approached. Kakin. Are your hands hurting from your explosions? Ugh. What do you think, stupid Deku? The blonde snarled at him as he huffed, throwing the can haphazardly, barely landing it in a nearby bin. You should know since you went and stole my quirk. I copied it. I didn't steal it. Izuku protested only to get an angry explosion appearing in Bakugo's palm in response, along with a glare. It's the same thing. Well, whatever. Here, at least I can help with the pain. Izuku said, and he pulled out the red glowing quirk, pushing it towards Bakugo, not seeing the blonde's eyes widen, or how he tried to back off for a moment before it zoomed towards him, seeming to settle above his core before fading in. Izuku briefly wondered if Bakugo would hear the same voice in him that Izuku heard, that helped him understand quirks once they were finally fully formed, recalling what it said when he made the quirk moments prior. Rapid minor healing. The user will passively heal any and all minor injuries, such as cuts and bruises, as well as making aches fade incredibly fast. It cannot heal any major wounds however, and cannot be turned off by the user at all. What the? Deku, what the hell did you do? The blonde screeched, making Izuku wince slightly, as he quickly explained. Hopefully, helping the blonde with his pain would make him a bit more amenable, right? I made a quirk. My quirk is really making quirks, but mom doesn't want me telling anyone, but if you're hurting, I figured I could help, you know. Now your arms won't ache when you're using your quirk. It was a really cool quirk I saw I thought you would be able to use. He said with hope that it would make the explosive child in front of him happy, only to be met with a death glare. You stupid nerd. He yelled, suddenly lashing out and putting his hand on Izuku's chest, blowing him to the ground and making him yelp as he tumbled over. I didn't ask for your worthless help, Deku. I don't want your stupid quirks. Take it back. I don't know how. You gave me some stupid extras quirk and you can't even take it back. Izuku left school that day with 3 things. 1. Burns. Bakugo really hadn't been happy, though Izuku felt somewhat guilty as well still. Which is where the second and third things came in. He'd never give someone else a quirk again without asking. He promised himself, as a rule, to not do that from now on. He didn't regret trying to help Bakugo with his pain, but he didn't really consider the possibility of someone not wanting a quirk. The other rule he was a little surprised with at first, but quickly became firm on, because while he might not have felt too bad about giving Bakugo a healing quirk, his anger at it also being someone else's quirk had struck more deeply. Because the more he thought about it, the more he thought maybe, just maybe, that was a more justifiable thing to be angry about. Quirks tended to be unique to people, a part of their identity, even if not everyone liked them. For many people they became another way to express themselves even if it was in small ways. Much like how whenever his mom was angry something would often end up flying across the room towards her. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt off about the idea that he'd be defined by Bakugo's quirk, that everyone would see the power he was using and think of Bakugo. Yes, it hadn't been too hard to come to the decision afterwards to practice hard on making unique quirks. He'd never give identical quirks unless he absolutely had to from now on. It would be about a year later that another rule was added to the list, albeit not one of his own making, but rather one he had found to be imposed by his own quirk. Rule number 3. Every quirk must have a downside. Izuku and his mother walked into the empty warehouse, the stars twinkling in the sky due to the late hour, as they found themselves on the top floor of a nearby parking center. It was an odd place for the two to be in at all, since Inko didn't have a car, let alone at the almost 1 in the morning, but there was a reason for their late visit, as they needed there to be no cars around so it would be safe. Are you sure about this, Izuku? His mother asked a little worriedly, as she walked ahead of him a little bit, turning to him only for him to nod. I'm pretty sure. I've copied your quirks tons, and I've gotten Dad's down. Now all I need to do is put them together properly and keep it this time. Then I'll finally have my own quirk and won't have to pretend to keep using Bakugos. It was a force of habit sometimes to refer to the blonde by the endearing nickname, but ever since he'd come home and admitted to his mother he told Bakugo the truth. She'd been insisting on him keeping away from the blonde, and honestly, aside from the times Bakugo seemed to seek him out, Izuku was much happier for it. Trying to fool himself that he wanted to be friends with Bakugo had been so tiring. Well, I'm ready when you are then in case anything goes wrong. Inko nodded with understanding, knowing how important it was to Izuku to finally have a power to call his own that couldn't be tied to someone else. Go ahead, sweetie. With a nod, Izuku took a deep breath and began focusing on his hands. Slowly, 2 lights began to emit from either hand, the soft green of his mother's attraction quirk, a familiar appearing, and quickly magnetizing to the other light, a harsh orange Izuku was less familiar with but still knew well as his father's fire quirk. They slowly began to mix together as he concentrated on the aspects he wanted for the quirk he had envisioned. He had to suppress a snicker, knowing what the quirk would hopefully be, as he pulled it into his body. It took a moment to settle, but it eventually did, and Izuku took a deep breath as the now familiar feeling of a new quirk washed over him. Iroh's gaze allows the user to set small fires from a distance, so long as whatever they wish to light on fire is in sight. The user cannot set fire to anything out of sight, and the fire cannot grow bigger than the size of the user's own hand. Izuku blinked in surprise, then furrowed his brow with a frown of confusion. Huh? I didn't add that. Sweetie. Inko tilted her head in confusion as well, holding her hands together as she waited on him. What do you mean? Did it not work? It did. He quickly assured her with a wave of his hand before a soft pout took over his face, one she couldn't help but giggle at due to it being both cute and funny, as he explained. But it decided on its own that I can't do anything I can't see, even though your quirk doesn't have that limit, Mom. I knew it would be small to be safe, but the seeing thing wasn't me. Inko blinked in surprise, then raised a hand to her chin with a small hum before letting out a small ah in realization as she smiled somewhat bashfully. I think that might be the weakness of your quirk, sweetie, since all quirks tend to have one. She explained as she walked over, patting his shoulder in a comforting gesture. You can't make quirks that don't have weaknesses. They have to have one. Your father couldn't control what they would be at all, he just had to hope for the best most of the time. If you're lucky, yours being stronger might mean you can at least choose your downsides, although, based on this, maybe it's half and half. Half and half. The freckled child repeated with uncertainty, making her nod as she thought how to explain before talking again. Well, maybe some quirks the downside you choose will be enough to satisfy your quirk's downside, as it were, but others it might add more on. She suggested, making Izuku let out a small groan. That's not fair. He huffed, making her let out another giggle in amusement at his annoyance at his own quirk. But I guess that makes sense. Yes, well, either way, don't you have a new quirk to try? She asked with soft amusement, rolling her eyes fondly as she saw how he immediately perked up and nodded before turning to a nearby railing. The hope was that because it was made solely of concrete and metal, the fire would just stay as is and fizzle out after a moment, unable to spread. If it did start to grow, his mother could put it out by attracting the fire to herself while it was still small and letting the wind from said action do the rest. With a deep breath, Izuku focused a glare at the railing. A moment later, a flame flared to life, making mother and son go wide-eyed before cheering in delight. Fortunately, it fizzled out on its own, as they hoped, and so, Izuku had a new quirk to use as his own. The quirk he would consider his main quirk whenever he wasn't being upfront about all for all. Iroh's gaze already felt much more like his own style than explosion anyways. He could live with this limitation, although what he didn't know was that it was not the only limitation his quirk would impose on itself. Rule number 4. No quirk manipulation negation quirks. As Izuku would figure over the years, having a unique quirk of his own entirely to himself and finally being able to come clean about all for all to his classmates did not spare him their ire abuse. Many were curious and in awe of his power when they first heard of it, which then rapidly descended into jealousy, discomfort at the idea of their usual victim having such a powerful quirk or entitled attitudes demanding quirks or else. It was that last one he knew when it was coming, he always knew when someone was about to demand a quirk. The last time had been 6 months ago and he'd gone down right away. They weren't ever subtle after all, especially not Nobu, the boy with the stretching fingers who was glaring right at Izuku today from just a seat behind. Already, Izuku knew he'd have to be on guard when lunchtime came around. Alright class. The teacher spoke up, making everyone turn to the front as the man pulled out some sheets of paper with a hum, barely giving them all another glance. I'm going to hand out some permission slips later for you to bring to your parents for the field trips this year. The important one is the second one, 6 months from now. I want as many of you accounted for as possible for the trip to the National Hero History Museum. We'll be pairing up with 2 other schools on the trip there. Izuku checked out about then, not all that worried about a field trip so far away compared to the more immediate problem of Nobu flexing his fingers under the table and keeping an eye on the clock. Unfortunately for Nobu, Izuku had had enough of this kind of attitude and came prepared today. Suddenly, a black glow began to form in Izuku's right hand while the soft and familiar green of his mother's quirk appeared in the other. The black quirk was lifted from an underground hero he'd found footage on that had a quirk that he thought might be perfect for getting his classmates off his back and defending himself without having to actually fight them. Erasure, the quirk to erase any emitter or transformation quirk on sight, would be a very easy way to keep down his classmates who seemed to think their quirks were literally all they were sometimes. But no one was looking, he let the 2 lights merge and the new dark green quirk slowly settled in his core. With a deep breath, he felt a warmth in his chest, followed by an odd ache in his stomach as the quirk took its temporary residence with him. Quirk switch. When the user focuses this quirk on someone else and closes their hand tight, it will turn off the person's quirk until the user opens their hand again, though they can only disable 2 people's quirks at a time. With a hum of content knowing he'd have a way to fight back, he returned to his work, trying to ignore the prickles on his neck every now and again when Nobu glared at him. Eventually, the bell began ringing, and Izuku found himself walking outside with everyone else, going for the main gate when he heard it. Deku. With a deep breath, he began sprinting. He got one chance to leave Izuku alone as he began running towards the station. Sadly, Nobu clearly didn't take it because he could hear rapid footsteps behind. With a groan, he turned and tried to duck into an alleyway, only to end up slowing his run about halfway in when he came across an unfortunate obstacle. A brick wall. It looked like he was going with plan A after all. With a sigh, he turned to the boy who was approaching him at a more stalker-like pace now, making Izuku's skin crawl slightly. Seeing anyone with rapidly elongating fingers approaching, as little more than a silhouette in the dark, would creep most people out after all. "What do you want, Nobu?" Izuku asked with a sigh as the boy got closer, slowly trying to pull on the newly made quirk he had and trying to ignore the odd tug in his stomach it made him feel to do so. "I want claws and you're going to give me them," the other boy demanded with a perverse excitement in his eyes. "Or else. Then I can do just as much damage as Bakugo." "Seriously?" Izuku asked, not even impressed, as he hunched forward, eyes closing halfway in an unimpressed and uninterested expression before a moment later his eyes flashed black as he closed his hand tight. "As if I'm going to give you claws when your nails already scratch me enough. What do I look like I want to die? How about no quirk at all instead?" Without ado, the fingers rapidly began devolving back to normal, but to Izuku's shock, as much as Nobu's, the boy's fingers didn't fully go back to normal, but seemed to get stuck being twice as long as normal. "What did you do?" the boy demanded with a light growl as he began shaking his hands as if trying to force his fingers to grow again. "Why wouldn't my fingers change again? I was meant to turn your quirk off, not I don't know what this is." Izuku replied with a slightly shaky breath in concern before his eyes widened as Nobu turned to him with a burning glare and suddenly charged. And to think, he made Quirk switch because he didn't want to fight. Ironic. With a deep breath he rushed forward himself at the last moment as the boy in front of him let out an enraged scream, thrusting both hands forward. No doubt, he was trying to poke Izuku's eyes out with his reach, but the freckled teen saw that coming, smacking the boy's hand down and using his own momentum to try and jump over the other boy. He knew he wouldn't make the full jump, but he didn't intend to. It hurt when he felt Nobu barrel into his body before he tumbled forward to the boy, his face rapidly approaching the ground as he threw his hands out, using the first quirk that came to mind, and really the only one he had ready to use for this situation. Boom. Explosions went off from either palm, and suddenly Izuku was flying way up into the air, eyes widening as he flipped around before flailing as he fell from surprisingly high up, only barely catching onto a nearby fire escape at the last moment with a groan. After a moment to take a deep breath he pulled himself over, looking down below to see Nobu clutching his head after having run straight into the wall, before looking for him. With a small groan, Izuku turned and bolted off onto the roofs, deciding to just make a getaway as an angry grimace settled on his face. Well, that failed miserably. What the heck was that? Why didn't it work? He wondered as he began to slow down after making his way across a few connected roofs, finally coming to a stop on a little garden area that seemed to be more publicly accessible and thus safe to get down from. With a grunt, he found himself dropping into a nearby bench with a huff and looking at his hands. Why didn't it work? The quirk had settled in just fine, except it hadn't, really. The ache in his stomach really should have been a sign something was off. Izuku didn't know what was off though. He did everything the same as usual, there was no reason for it to not work as well as usual, especially as the quirk more or less, as he imagined it had been confirmed to work with how he gave it to himself. So why did it falter when it was being used? With a sigh, he dropped his hands and looked down to the street below, noting some kind of villain fight seemed to be going on. Normally he'd be excited, but he was admittedly a little mopey about his main plan to avoid having to fight his classmates, which was really just a waste of time and a constant risk of getting a mark on his record, having failed completely. With a shake of his head and a huff, he found his mind racing again. It was a setback, but he couldn't give up. He could make all sorts of quirks, he just had to think of a different solution. The one that immediately came to mind was running away, of course, like he tried before. The problem was often that he'd run out of stamina even if he was faster, long before the people chasing him. Plus, they tended to be physically stronger than him, no quirks involved. He found his eyes drawn to a large mural on the wall. One of All Might doing his signature lifted arms pose. One with a massive crack in it as Maruko, the number 8 heroine, had just been smacked by the villain right into the wall and the impact had put a massive splintering crack in All Might's crotch area. Izuku found his attention remaining on the mural mostly though, knowing Maruko could take much worse damage than that. All Might, well his real quirk wasn't known, has always been known for at least having confirmed super strength and super speed. Izuku found himself considering it as he stared with a hum, biting his lip and thought. On the one hand, he would be able to outrun and outgun any of his bullies easily if he needed to, but he found himself pausing. See, ever since he'd had his revelation about how quirks could relate to people on a personal level, he'd found himself considering certain quirks a bit more closely, and if he was being honest, in a way he didn't like the idea of having straight super strength and super speed. Sure, logistically it would be an amazing asset, but from a personal standpoint something about it felt bland. Impersonal. It didn't feel like it would fit him, in a way. It was an odd feeling to contend with, really. Maybe he should suck it up and do it anyway. For his own sake. Would that be a bad idea if he didn't take to this quirk as well as he liked to take to others? One thing was for sure, he wouldn't try to do anything close to All Might's quirk. He didn't even want to go near All Might's quirk really, and not just out of a fanboy sense of respect, but rather fear of just how badly trying to mess with that quirk could go. There was no way it was a normal quirk after all with how mangled and meshed together it was, compared to most quirks. What would be an acceptable level of strength or speed though? The idea of intense super strength was honestly scary, as well as without the right durability to handle it, it could quickly become a disaster. Perhaps. Before he could continue on with his thoughts, a loud voice rang out making him jump and pulled his attention back to the fight with a loud cry. Luna fall. He found himself hurrying to the edge, looking over it and seeing Maruko driving her feet into the villain, who seemed to be a mostly nondescript figure in a tattered brown cloak, right into the ground and knocking him out cleanly, jumping off him with a feral grin. He'd always been a little put off by the heroine, with how she could remind him of Bakugo, though he had to admit he was envious of her in the sense that her insistence on training every day and pushing yourself regardless of your quirk would make you strong was one of the few positive heroic messages out there that didn't seem to have much of a caveat. Actually, now that he thought about it, was Maruko not simply at her peak? Her quirk may have given that peak a boost, but there wasn't that much complexity to it, was there? What if he was at his own peak? Without going to the level that many quirks brought, why not simply speed up the process of more regular training? But the final hum, he smiled as he got up and began walking to the exit, excited to do some quirk research. He supposed he could be thankful to Maruko, even if he wasn't sure he liked her entirely with some of her tics, for at least indirectly helping him solve his problem with a new quirk idea. As for the quirk negation quirk, he would later come to the conclusion that while he could make negation and manipulation quirks for actual quirks, there was little to no points. They were always extremely weak. Still, about 2 months later, he'd at least have his third permanent quirk settling into his body. Unlocked potential. The user is constantly at their peak possible physical strength, speed, endurance, ACT. In relation to their age, bordering on superhuman. It is a permanently active ability, but comes at the cost of lessening the effects of adrenaline, including entirely negating the pain suppression aspects, leaving the user to have to feel every ache and pain from overworking their body. That was the last permanent quirk he'd made, and he hadn't had any more rules until just a day before the present day, when he gained one of his biggest rules yet. Rule number 5. No time quirks. Ever. It had been in his apartment his mother called on him, her voice a little unsteady, as he was washing the dishes after dinner. She'd decided to make an extra big meal, knowing he was going on a field trip tomorrow, and so might not be back at the usual time tomorrow. Izuku. The freckled teen blinked and looked up from where he was drying off a glass, turning to her with a curious tilt of his head. He frowned as he saw her tapping her finger on the table nervously. Mom. Is something wrong? Not exactly. She shook her head before sighing as she gestured to the phone. It's just your father is going to call soon. Izuku went wide-eyed, quickly putting the dishes down and turning fully with surprise and a bit of excitement. Really? But it's not the usual time. Yes, but we have something important to tell you. His mother said vaguely, and he felt his excitement die a little bit at the serious tone in her voice. Then her eyes met his. Specifically, about your father's quirk and the real reason he had to leave. The full story. Izuku felt his arms shake slightly at that, but before he could ask more. Ring. 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 Mother and son turned to the receiver on the wall, and Izuku bit his lip before, with a nod from his mother, he walked up to the wall and took the phone into his hand. Hello. Hello. Izuku, is that you? Why yeah, it's me Dad. How are you? I'm good. It's good to hear from you again, kiddo. Just wish it was for something less heavy. Izuku felt his breath hitch slightly as he pressed on. Mom said you wanted to talk about your quirk. And why are you hiding? Yeah, I do. He heard his father sigh tiredly on the other end before he continued on. She didn't want me to tell you quite this soon, but I think it would be better if you knew sooner rather than later. Especially since you're not hiding your quirk. Izuku couldn't think of anything to say in reply, so he just kept listening as father began explaining. Explaining about his past, about how quirks used to be viewed. How he had brothers. How he was kidnapped and tortured. Izuku felt his stomach flipping slightly, and an ill feeling settled on him as his father told him what happened. Then what happened when he finally broke. The world he found himself in, and the people he found. Both good and bad. Why would they do that to you? Izuku couldn't help but ask with a small whine, feeling awful for his father at the idea of what he went to. A sad sigh came from the other end. Because some people are just awful, Izuku. I don't like talking about it and I don't want to upset you, but I also want you to be prepared for what some people may be like with your quirk. That's why I wanted to tell you even sooner than this, but this was the earliest Inko would let me tell you. Either way, that's not the most important thing at the moment. It's not. Izuku asked in surprise, and a silence settled for a moment. He was almost worried the call would be cut out when his father spoke up again. I want you to promise me you'll never mess with time quirks. Ever. They're too dangerous to go near at all. I don't want what happened to me to happen to you. Izuku felt his breath hitch slightly. In theory, he could make time quirks without any issue so far. Nothing he'd struggled with before would imply he would be unable to, and his father confirmed he could do it. Quite the powerful ability to just throw aside. But the desperation in his father's voice made something curl up in his very heart. Please no time quirks, I promise. He said quietly. I won't make any time quirks. A sigh of relief sounded from the other end, and he could practically hear his father slumping over in relief. Thank you. Thank you. But the soft nod, Izuku knew he'd keep that promise as one of the most firm rules on the list. He wouldn't expect to have to deny such a quirk as soon as the next day though. Present day. Izuku sighed as he walked with his class onto the bus, the second of the 3 groups to be picked up as he walked nearer the back. The students from the other schools seemed mostly unnoteworthy, aside from a few especially interesting mutations. He did almost catch himself staring before stopping himself at the last moment at one especially pretty girl with bright pink skin and hair, as well as horns, continuing before anyone could notice, and sitting down. The girl seemed to be busy chatting away happily with another girl who was mostly uninterested in the conversation, if the way she was focusing more on her phone than the pink-skinned girl was any indication. He ended up dropping into a lone seat separated from everyone else in the middle that worked just fine for him, letting him ignore most everyone around him, just focusing on writing down notes in a journal for some quirks he had been especially interested in lately. He'd seen a rather cool quirk a few days ago at a public park with a man seemingly turning into solid wood so long as he was in the vicinity of the material, as if sapping the types of wood around him into his body. He was busy writing down the practical applications and potential weaknesses, absorbed in his work to the point he almost didn't notice when the bus came to another halt and another final set of students made their way onto the bus. The only reason he really looked up to properly take them in at all was because, as someone was walking past him, he heard a hiss. Not an angry one, but a pained one. Looking up, he ended up following the source to a girl with short purple hair and a black sailor-style school uniform, sitting down with a grunt and covering her ears after a moment, looking out the window with a grouchy expression. With confusion he turned to the rest of the bus, and was it really that noisy? It was certainly hard to focus, but it wasn't what he'd call overwhelming. His eyes went back to the girl and paused when he saw something dangling off her ears. Some kind of hearing mutation. He paused with a bit of hesitancy before he made a decision and stood up suddenly, walking towards the back where the girl was more or less alone. Did she not have friends to sit beside? A moment later he dropped into the seat beside her and she turned to him with a clearly confused expression on her face and a slight grimace, seemingly at the idea of social interaction, making him chuckle slightly as he held up his hands. Don't worry, I'm not coming over to bug you or anything, I don't want to sit with other people. I was staying away from my class as well. I just wanted to ask, is the noise too much for you here? He asked with a soft tone, trying to convey he really just wanted to make sure she was okay. The girl was quiet for a moment before she shrugged and turned to him properly with a light groan. Kind of. My quirk gives me really good hearing, but it also means it's really easy for it to all become overwhelming. Especially since I have sensory overload. She explained with a small sigh, and Izuku blinked in surprise, going quiet for a moment in thought. This was kind of what All for All was perfect for, wasn't it? Almost its natural use in a quirky society. The weaknesses, the severe weaknesses and downsides of pre-existing quirks such as that, he could find ways to negate or lessen and make people more powerful. Perhaps, well, it had been a while since he offered, but it wasn't like this girl was in his class to demand more for the future if she turned out to be like everyone else. Would you want something to help you deal with it? He asked, making her tilt her head with a slightly confused look and a raised brow. What, are you carrying around some noise-canceling headphones with you? She joked, and he couldn't help his own chuckle as he shook his head. Nah, just the ability to make quirks. He joked, making her snort and roll her eyes as she gave him an unimpressed look. Yeah, right. she said blithely, only to pause when she saw him giving her a softly amused look in return that had no signs of joking on it. "You're not being serious, right?" Izuku simply held out his hand, turning his palm and revealing the soft glow of a gentle gray quirk appearing and swirling almost like smoke in his hand. "I can create quirks. I can only give so many away to another person, but they're safe, and well, it wouldn't be all that heroic to just leave you suffering sensory overload when I could help, would it? You want to be a hero too?" She asked quietly in surprise, and he nodded, making her hum quietly. After a moment, she managed a more nervous smile, yet it also seemed more genuine. It was surprisingly endearing and cute, though he had a feeling she would not take well to him saying so out loud. "Then sure, I guess I might as well take a chance. Let's see what you got." Izuku chuckled, and another light lit up in his hand, this one a dull red, as he pulled the two quirks together, letting them melt together and slowly float up before flying towards the girl's chest and settling in with a light glow. Sensory deprivation allows the user to completely remove any of their senses or the senses of others at will by focusing on them, only giving them back when they are ready to, while strengthening other senses in the process. The user cannot however take away more than sense at a time and cannot reduce senses, only take them away entirely. The purple-haired girl's eyes widened as she felt it settle in her body before she closed her eyes and seemed to focus on something. Then a notable sigh of relief escaped her as her eyes opened and she smiled a bright smile. "Thanks, seriously. That's so much better," she told him, and he smiled wide and gave a thumbs up. "No problem," he replied, only for her to blink at him and him to blush as he remembered she couldn't actually hear him now. She seemed to snort, then a moment later she winced before sighing. "I'll enjoy the quiet a bit more in a moment, but honestly, that's amazing. You have a pretty cool quirk, dude. Didn't know they made them that strong." Izuku sputtered slightly, then chuckled in amusement and beamed wide in amusement, making her blush slightly and look away, muttering something about him being too bright that he didn't understand. "Anyways, my name's Kyokajiru. It's nice to meet you even if it's only for this trip. Izuku Midoriya," he replied with a smile, holding his hand out which made her grin and put her own hand out, shaking his hand for a moment in amusement as she chuckled in amusement. "Nice to meet you too. Do you mind if I chill out with you during the trip?" she asked with a hum as she leaned back in her chair, making Izuku blink in surprise at the casualty question. "Not really fond of my classmates, and you already seem a lot nicer than them." "Oh, well sure." He smiled sweetly with a small, surprised blush as he grinned happily. "I don't really have anyone in my class I'd want to hang out with anyways, so it will be nice to not be alone at least." "Awesome." Then before Kyoka could continue though, a sort of sneering voice spoke up and the words they spoke made Izuku freeze instantly as they gave a haughty sort of laugh. "Oh, what's this, Jiru, you're actually hanging out with a guy. Didn't think a freaky lesbo like you could handle that." A red-heated and pimpled girl snickered, making Kyoka freeze, then groan and look away with an angry frown, seemingly used to this. Izuku meanwhile stiffened, his eye twitching slightly. He'd gotten pretty used to his own bullies, he almost forgot what it was like to see someone else get bullied. How much angrier he found himself over it. He didn't notice as the bus went quiet at the words. Some of Kyoka's class seemed to be snickering. The other class were quiet, but their eyes seemed to be darting between the back and somewhere else on the bus. Izuku didn't notice the pink figure standing up with an angrier look though, as he rose up himself, in front of the red-head with a harsh glare, not seeing Kyoka's eyes widen in surprise beside him. "What did you call her?" "A freaky little lesbo." The red-head replied with a snort. "She's always so obsessed with other girls, it's creepy. Maybe you should get away from her before. Maybe you should shut it." Izuku replied harshly, making the girl wince slightly in surprise, her eyes widening with shock at being talked back to. He was well aware of what the word meant because he knew one of his mom's friends was relentlessly harassed in the past by other people for being into women. "My quirk's pyro gaze, it lets me set small fires with a look. If I hear you call her that again, your hair will be orange for an entirely different reason." The girl sputtered before glaring at him with anger in her eyes. Before she could do anything more though a familiar growling voice made Izuku freeze, then groan. "Deku." Bakugo just had to growl out, getting involved, as he turned. "Fuck off, no one gives a shit what you have to extras have to say, especially you. Just keep your stupid ass quiet." "What is your problem, Blondie?" a new voice asked, making then turn to see the pink-skinned girl Izuku had noticed before glaring at him with a light pout. "He's just trying to help. No one asked you, extra." He growled, an explosion lighting up in her hand making her deadpan rather than cower. "You're all getting on my fucking nerves. And you and that orange-haired girl are the ones who are being jerks who should mind their own business." It was after she said that the girl she'd been sitting beside who Izuku had assumed was a friend of hers spoke up and confirmed she was definitely not a friend as she grumbled something heinous to them all. Says the mutie who won't stop getting in other people's faces all the time. That made the entire bus go quiet and cold. Even several Aldera students stiffened, being mutants themselves. The pink-skinned girl noticeably winced and looked winded for a moment like she was expecting it, genuinely hurt, while an angry growl erupted from Kayaka to Izuku's side as the slur. Izuku however found his eyes meeting the mutinous girl's, and with not more than a deep angry breath, her seat suddenly burst into flame making her yelp and jump off the seat. Bakugo growled and turned to Izuku in annoyance as the girls went wide-eyed, but before it could escalate further. Alright, that's enough playing around, kids. The teacher that had joined Kayaka's class spoke up in a bored voice, making Izuku almost do a double take at how dismissive she sounded. Even his own teacher, who Izuku knew was a pretty lousy excuse for a decent teacher, seemed to be shocked she had nothing more to say, while the pink-skinned girl's teacher actually wasn't present. Of course, it seemed that if she was the good one, she was also the one who unfortunately took her eyes off the classes at the wrong moment to go ask the driver something. Now, sit back down and be quiet or the driver will pull over and we'll have to walk. She told them, making them all just stare in disbelief. Then, the redhead went back to her seat, followed by a grumbling Bakugo of his own. The pink-skinned girl though, and Izuku really needed to ask her name and stop calling her that in his head, just stood stock still in shock until he spoke up gently. Do you want to sit down beside us? He asked gently, sitting back down by himself and patting the empty seat on his other side. With a soft nod, she sat down and looked down in thought. I'm sorry she said something that cruel. I mean I knew she wasn't my friend. She said simply with a small hum. She didn't seem to be crying, just quiet and upset. I was just kinda talking with her since my actual friends called out of the trip. I didn't realize she disliked me that much. Well, she sounds like she's a moron anyways. Kayaka tried comforting with a questionable approach, although the blunt attitude seemed to make Mina snort, so maybe it was working. And hey, you stood up for me, and Green. Izuku sputtered in surprise at the nickname, making her snort and poke his cheek with a jack. Yeah, Green. Cause your hair. Anyways, you stood up for us, Pinky, so thanks for that, and in return, we'll stand up for you if she says anything else. Jiru assured, before humming in thought. And I guess you're okay with one more person, Green. I don't like big groups of people, but since we don't have anyone else we'd want to hang out with anyways. Well, I guess it's up to he turned to the pink-skinned girl with a bashful blush and rubbed the back of his neck with a nervous chuckle. Sorry, what is your name? After a moment, a small giggle escaped her and a smile was already coming back onto her face, much to their surprise. Wow, she perked back up surprisingly fast. Mina Ishido, but you can just call me Ashai. You definitely earned nickname rights for standing up for me before. Izuku blushed at that and sputtered while Kayaka snorted in amusement, giving a small grin as she gestured between herself and Izuku. Awesome. I'm Kyoka Jiru and this is Izuku Midoriya. Midori and Kyo. Got it. She giggled, making Izuku blush harder, and Kayaka sputtered slightly before letting out a nervous chuckle of her own and shaking her head seemingly a little amused. Thanks for making sure I didn't have to melt anyone's clothes. Wait, what? Izuku asked in confusion, making her giggle in amusement and wave her hand with a mischievous glint. Like Quirk's acid, it lets me melt things. I also happen to hate bullies, so if you hadn't stepped in, I might have decided to take away Miss Homophobe's uniform. Blasties too. She said simply, making the other two stare before snorting after a moment and starting to giggle, imagining the chaos that would have brought on. I don't know if that would be a great idea. Izuku said, even though he chuckled in amusement as the mental image of Bakugo's clothes dropping and the blonde letting out a pterodactyl-like shriek of surprise invaded his mind, making his amusement double. That could really go wrong, Ishido. Well, I'm full of bad ideas and no filter, it happens. Mina said with a smug grin as she stuck out her tongue in amusement, making Kayaka snort again during her own laugh, smirking back. Well, maybe Green could make you a quirk to deal with that. She said, only for Mina to pause, then stare in confusion, and Kayaka to pause as well. Ah, shit. I mean, it's fine, Jiru. Izuku was in amusement, glad to see her relax when he said as much. I'm not hiding my real quirk, I just didn't feel like announcing it to the whole bus. Your real quirk? Mina asked with curiosity and confusion as her mouth felt open slightly and she squinted with a mild head tilt as if trying to decipher what on earth they were talking about by scrutinizing him alone. Well, yeah. My actual quirk is the ability to make quirks from scratch, but people tend to freak out when you tell them that all at once. He said in amusement, watching as Mina's fairly pretty golden eyes blew wide in shock as her jaw dropped open fully. Then a sparkle took over her eyes as she leaned in excitedly. No way. That's so cool. That's got to be like top 10 material for sure. she said in awe, making Izuku chuckle a little bashfully as she leaned in before pausing and then smiling. "Oh, you keep up with the pro hero rankings too?" he asked in surprise, and she paused then chuckled a little more bashfully as she shrugged. "Well, I keep up with the top ones at least. Got to know who the best heroes are to know what to aim for if I want to be one, right?" she asked in amusement, making Izuku light up excitedly while Kayaka chuckled in amusement. "Wow, so all three of us want to be heroes then?" she asked amused, making Mina's eyes light up for a second time in excitement as she leaned in. "Whoa, really awesome. Now I really want to get to know you both. Oh, this field trip might actually be super fun after all." She cheered excitedly, throwing her hands up into the air excitedly before looking down. "So, can I ask, like, is there any limit to what you can make? Because like, that's just so op as heck. I mean, can you just do whatever you like basically?" "Well, not exactly. There are some things I can't control, like the downsides to most quirks. My quirk means that any quirk I make needs to have a downside which it often decides itself. P+, I can only give so many away per person, and certain abilities I just can't make, like quirks that mess with other quirks. Aside from that though, yeah, I can do quite a lot," he admitted with a shy chuckle as he leaned back in his seat, noticing Kyoka humming and clearly thinking over what that meant for his quirk, while Mina nodded with an eager awe, then let out a small chuckle of amusement. Then she said something that made Izuku briefly freeze. It was clear from her tone she was joking, but nevertheless, after the conversation from the previous day it made something in him tense. "You don't think you could give me a quirk to go back in time and retry my English exam, do you?" The girls must have noticed the way he stiffened because Kyoka gave him a confused look while Mina seemed to wince and frown in worry. Just before she could speak up, he gave his answer. Soft, but firm. "I'm sorry, I don't have time quirks. Ever. Sorry I didn't mean to upset you or anything," she said awkwardly, and he winced, frowning at the idea he'd already messed up with one of the first two people he'd managed to somewhat befriend in a while now. "It's fine, it's not." He took a deep breath, then hummed as he looked down. "I just know time quirks can end really badly, but I didn't mean to sound harsh or anything." They went quiet for another moment, then Izuku spoke again, blurting out the first thing he could think of to try and get them back to speaking again. "Do you know your quirk looks like a really bright green?" "You can see my quirk?" she asked, and a sudden gasp and sparkle of excitement let him know his decision had been right away, smiling as he nodded. "Yeah, it's a kind of neon green that's really bright to look at." He nodded before turning to Kayaka with a small hum. "And yours is more like a dark blue purplish color. It's actually really soothing." The purple-haired girl blushed at that as a grin settled on Mina's face as they continued to talk, curious what else they could find out about their quirks just from Izuku looking at them, slowly getting comfortable with each other, and the idea they'd end up spending the day together just in time for the bus pulling up to the museum. What they wouldn't know until much later was that just around the corner from where their bus parked, a van full of masked men were waiting eagerly with a bag of guns and dangerous quirks ready to be used. "Looks like the schools did, as we asked, boss," a short red-headed man in the passenger's seat said excitedly as he licked a blade protruding out of his middle, most knuckle eagerly. "So many kids to take, the payout will be huge. So long as our buyer lives up to their word about paying for strong quirks." The boss, a taller man in a purple theater mask and black overcoat hummed. "We'll give them a couple minutes before we go in. No one needs to know we paid the schools to bring the brats to us." The rest of the men around him chuckled and he smirked as he caught the shine of his metallic hand on the wheel. These kids were going to make the Violet Devils a fortune if the MLA were really willing to pay as much as they said they were for new strong soldiers. The end. Thanks for watching my video, leave a like if you enjoyed my video and also do consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome content. See you next time, till then sayonara.